The cold breeze stung my cheeks as I stood on the porch, clutching the phone with trembling fingers. The words I had just heard echoed in my mind, refusing to fade away. "Clara, we've decided you're no longer welcome at this year's holiday gathering." My brother's voice was firm, unyielding, as if he were delivering a verdict rather than a message meant to keep peace. I hadn't expected this. Never once had I imagined that after all these years of shared birthdays, laughter and tears, I would be shut out like a stranger. The call ended abruptly, leaving me suspended in a silence that felt heavier than the winter night around me. I sank onto the wooden steps, the rough grain digging into my palms, grounding me as the shock rippled through my chest. How could this be? Just last month we had spoken at length about plans, about traditions we all looked forward to every year. I remembered Mom's excitement, my sister's jokes, even my own carefully planned contribution to the feast. And now nothing. A sudden, inexplicable exile. I thought back to the last family dinner, the laughter, the warmth, the easy conversations. Nothing had seemed amiss. Could I have missed something? Had I said or done something without realizing? The questions churned relentlessly, but no answers came. When I called again, my siblings offered vague apologies, their voices clipped and distant. "It's complicated, Clara. Maybe another time." That was all. I sat on my steps long after the phone had gone silent, my breath fogging in the cold air. The sting of rejection was sharp, deeper than I expected. It wasn't just the holiday or the gathering. It was the sudden erasure of a place I thought I held in their hearts. The space at the table, once reserved for me, had been claimed by absence. I felt isolated not just from them, but from a part of myself that had always found comfort in family. That night sleep eluded me. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment I shared with my family in recent months. Had I been too busy? Too distant? Or had something else been festering beneath the surface, hidden from my view? The silence between us now felt like an invisible wall, cold and impenetrable. I refused to let this exclusion define me, but the uncertainty gnawed at my resolve. The next morning I found myself pacing the kitchen, the kettle forgotten on the stove as I tried to gather my scattered thoughts. I called my closest friends, needing to voice the pain, the confusion. They reminded me who I was, who I had always been to my family, a devoted sister, daughter, and aunt. Their words wrapped around me like a protective shawl, offering warmth in the chill of my isolation. But I knew the answers wouldn't come from outside. If I wanted to understand why I had been pushed out, I had to confront the situation directly. Not with anger or despair, but with clarity and courage. I resolved to reach out to each sibling individually, to listen, to ask questions, and to seek the truth behind the silence. Days passed, and with every call, I sensed the tension that had built up over time. The conversations were guarded, filled with half-truths and evasions. Yet, beneath the surface, cracks appeared. Hints of misunderstandings, whispers of rumors that had twisted my image in their minds. It became clear that the exclusion wasn't spontaneous but the result of a slow erosion of trust and miscommunication. I remembered the countless times I had supported them, in celebrations, crises, and everyday moments. I recalled lending money when their finances faltered, offering a shoulder during hardships, and always showing up even when my own life was tangled with challenges. It pained me to think these acts had been overshadowed by shadows of doubt and suspicion. Determined not to be a passive victim, I began gathering what I could. Messages, photos, and memories that told the story of my true intentions. I reached out to extended family and friends, those who had witnessed my care and contributions over the years. Their affirmations became small beacons of hope, reminders that the truth was still alive, waiting to be seen. One afternoon, as I sat in the quiet of my living room, I made a list, a map of the journey I needed to take. I would confront the misconceptions, not with accusations but with honesty. I would show them the reality behind the rumors, the love that had never wavered. Most importantly, I would hold space for healing, for forgiveness, and for rebuilding what had been broken. Yet, beneath the determination, I felt a knot of vulnerability. What if they rejected me again? What if the wounds ran too deep? But the alternative, silence and absence, was a fate I could not accept. I owed it to myself and to the family I still loved to fight for a place at the table. As the holiday approached, I prepared myself emotionally. I practiced what I might say, how I would listen, how I would respond with grace even if met with resistance. I knew this wouldn't be easy, but sometimes healing begins with discomfort. I resolved to show up, not just physically but with an open heart. On the eve of the gathering, I packed a small bag, not just with gifts and food, but with the intangible tools of courage and forgiveness. The house felt emptier without the usual bustle of preparation, the familiar sense of baking and spices absent. Yet, in that quiet I found a strange kind of strength. This exclusion, painful as it was no longer a dead end. It was the beginning of a journey I was ready to undertake. I stood by the window watching the snow begin to fall softly, covering the world in white. The cold outside mirrored the chill I felt within, but I refused to let it freeze my spirit. Tomorrow I would face my family, not as the outcast they had declared me to be, but as Clara, a woman who loved fiercely and refused to be erased. And with that resolve, I finally allowed myself to rest, knowing the path ahead would be difficult but necessary. The silence between us was no longer a wall, but a space waiting to be filled with truth. The morning light filtered weakly through the kitchen blinds as I sat at the table, a notebook open before me. My fingers trembled slightly as I flipped through the pages filled with scribbled notes and phone numbers. Over the past week I had been reaching out, not just to my siblings but to cousins, aunts, and even old family friends, piecing together the story behind the sudden frost that had settled over us. What I uncovered was a tangled web of misunderstandings and whispered rumors, each thread more painful than the last. One call stood out, a conversation with my cousin Rachel. Her voice was hesitant at first, but as she spoke, the pieces began to fall into place. "Clara, I didn't know how to tell you, but there's been talk. Things about you that just aren't true." She hesitated, then confessed she had heard rumors that I was somehow distant, uncaring, even selfish. "It's not what I believe," she added quickly, "but many have been led to think that." I closed my eyes and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Rumors. Lies that had crept in quietly, poisoning the well of trust. How had I been so blind? I thought about the years I had poured into this family, the holidays I organized, the times I dropped everything to help, the countless small sacrifices no one seemed to remember now. And yet, all of it was overshadowed by shadows I hadn't even seen. Determined to set the record straight, I began gathering evidence. Texts, emails, photographs, even old receipts that showed the money I had lent to siblings during their financial struggles. It wasn't about proving my worth. It was about reclaiming the narrative that had been twisted behind my back. I wanted them to see not a stranger, but the sister, the daughter, the aunt who had always stood by them. One afternoon I sat down with Sarah, my oldest and most trusted friend. She listened intently as I poured out the story, my voice wavering between anger and sadness. "You have to confront them," she said firmly. "But don't just defend yourself. Show them who you really are. Let them see the truth, and give them the chance to respond." Her words struck a chord. I realized I had been so focused on the hurt, on the exclusion, that I hadn't yet thought about how to rebuild the bridges. I needed a plan, not just for confrontation but for healing. I couldn't demand their forgiveness, but I could offer an olive branch, a willingness to listen and understand. I started drafting a letter, one that was honest but gentle. I wrote about my memories, my love for the family, and my pain at being shut out without explanation. I acknowledged that misunderstandings had taken root, and expressed my hope to clear the air. It wasn't easy to put my vulnerability on paper, but the act of writing felt like a first step toward reconciliation. As I prepared to reach out, I rehearsed what I might say during a face-to-face conversation. I imagined my siblings' guarded expressions, the walls they had built around themselves. I told myself to be patient, to listen without interrupting, even if their words stung. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about healing wounds that had been left to fester too long. Every day I felt my resolve strengthen. The fear of rejection still lingered, but it was now accompanied by a quiet determination. I reminded myself that family was complicated, that hurt and love often lived side by side. I was ready to face the discomfort if it meant breaking through the silence. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the snow accumulate, my phone buzzed with a message from my sister Emily. "Can we talk? I think we need to." My heart skipped a beat. This was the opening I had been waiting for. I replied quickly, agreeing to meet the next day. The conversation with Emily was tentative at first. She admitted she had been caught up in the rumors, unsure of what to believe. As I shared my side, she listened, her eyes softening. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. She promised to speak with the others, to help clear the misunderstandings. Buoyed by this small victory, I continued reaching out, one conversation at a time. Each exchange chipped away at the walls, revealing glimpses of the family I remembered. Flawed but capable of love and forgiveness. I realized that the path ahead would be slow and uncertain, but for the first time it felt possible. Late one night, I sat with my notebook, reviewing the plan I had laid out for the holiday intervention I hoped to make. I would arrive with open hands and an open heart, ready to listen as much as to speak. I would share the evidence not as weapons, but as mirrors reflecting the truth of my commitment. And I would ask for their stories in return, to understand what had driven us apart. As I closed the notebook, a quiet resolve settled over me. This was more than a fight to be included. It was a chance to rebuild trust, to heal old wounds, and to remind us all why family mattered in the first place. Whatever happened next, I knew I had taken the first steps toward reclaiming my place. Not just at the holiday table, but in their hearts. The morning of the holiday arrived colder and grayer than I had expected, the sky heavy with low clouds that seemed to press down on the small town where my family lived. I stood on the edge of their driveway, the familiar house just ahead, wrapped in a thick coat and clutching a small box of homemade cookies and the letter I had written. The letter was folded neatly in my pocket, a quiet testament to the words I wanted to say but wasn't sure I could speak aloud. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. The door opened before I could knock. It was my brother Michael, his face a mixture of surprise and something I couldn't quite place. Perhaps guilt, perhaps uncertainty. "Clara," he said, voice tight. "What are you doing here?" "I came to talk," I replied, forcing calm into my voice. "I know I wasn't invited, but I can't stay away. Not anymore." I stepped inside before he could respond, the warmth of the house enveloping me as the scent of cinnamon and pine filled the air. The living room was decorated festively, but the atmosphere felt subdued, as if the holiday cheer had been muted by the tension lurking beneath. My siblings and parents soon gathered, their expressions a mix of curiosity and guardedness. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, until I cleared my throat. "I know there have been things said about me, things that aren't true. I've spent the past week listening, learning, and gathering what I could to understand how we got here." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the letter, handing it to Michael. "This explains what I couldn't say out loud." He unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the words. I watched their faces as I spoke, trying to keep my voice steady. "I love this family. I always have. I've made mistakes, I'm sure, but I've never stopped caring. The rumors that painted me as distant and uncaring, they hurt, but they're not the truth. I want to show you, to prove that I'm still the sister you knew." For a moment no one spoke. Then my sister Emily stepped forward, her eyes glistening. "Clara, it's hard to admit, but when the rumors started, I let them fill the space where your voice should have been. I didn't ask, I just believed the worst." Her words were a confession and an apology. "I'm sorry." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. "Thank you for saying that. Means more than you know. I hope we can all move past this." As the conversation unfolded, I shared the evidence I had gathered. Messages of support I had sent, photos from family events, even the records of money I had lent when times were tough. I wasn't trying to shame anyone, just to remind them of the truth behind the stories that had taken hold. To my surprise, the atmosphere began to shift. Laughter returned in small bursts, memories were exchanged, and the walls around their hearts seemed to soften. My parents, who had been quiet until then, spoke of their own regrets and hopes for healing. My father reached out and took my hand, his grip warm and steady. "We missed you, Clara. More than we realized." The hours passed, and the gathering transformed from a tense standoff into a tentative reunion. I watched as my siblings shared stories, teased each other, and even included me in the familiar rhythms of family life. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of awkwardness, silences filled with unspoken feelings, but it was a beginning. At one point, Michael pulled me aside into the kitchen. "I was wrong to shut you out," he admitted quietly. "I let fear and gossip cloud my judgment. I want us to be a family again." His words echoed my own hopes. I smiled, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. Me too. As the night wore on, I realized that by showing up, by speaking my truth, I had reclaimed a place not just at the table, but in their hearts. The holiday, once a source of pain and exclusion, was becoming a space for forgiveness and new beginnings. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, I was no longer alone in walking it. The morning after the gathering, light spilled softly through the curtains, casting a gentle glow across the living room where remnants of last night's reunion still lingered. The half-empty coffee mugs, scattered wrapping paper, the faint scent of pine and cinnamon. I sat quietly on the edge of the couch, reflecting on the fragile peace that had begun to settle among us. The night had been a breakthrough, but I knew healing wasn't instantaneous. It required patience and openness. Emily was the first to break the morning silence. She sat beside me, her expression earnest. "Clara, I've been thinking a lot about last night, and about everything that led to it. I realize now how much fear and misunderstanding kept us apart. I want to talk about those things, to be honest with you." Her words were a door opening, and I stepped through with cautious hope. "I want that too. I'm tired of pretending that everything's fine when it's not. Let's start fresh, with honesty." We began to unpack the feelings that had been buried, resentments, disappointments, and fears that none of us had voiced. Emily shared how she had felt overwhelmed by family drama, and had allowed doubts to grow unchecked. I spoke of the isolation I'd felt, the sting of being excluded without explanation. As we spoke, the walls between us crumbled, replaced by understanding. Soon the others joined us. Michael admitted he'd been defensive, afraid of confronting uncomfortable truths. Our parents expressed regret for not noticing the growing distance sooner. The conversations were raw and real, sometimes difficult, but always rooted in a shared desire to heal. Together we acknowledged mistakes made on all sides and the damage caused by silence and assumptions. Apologies were exchanged, not just as words but as heartfelt attempts to mend broken bonds. It was a moment heavy with emotion. Tears mingled with laughter, and the weight of past grievances began to lift. In the days that followed, we made a conscious effort to rebuild trust. We set new boundaries, agreeing to communicate more openly, and to check in with each other regularly. We recognized that old patterns needed to change if we wanted to move forward. One afternoon, as we worked together in the kitchen preparing a meal, I felt the warmth of connection rekindle. Conversations flowed freely, jokes were shared, and the ease that comes with genuine closeness returned. It was a stark contrast to the tense quiet that had filled the house just days before. I noticed how my siblings began to include me in plans once more, asking for my input and valuing my presence. Invitations were extended without hesitation, and I felt the invitation to belong extending beyond the holiday itself. Our parents too seemed lighter, their smiles more frequent. The family dynamic shifted subtly but unmistakably towards healing and renewal. It was as if the wounds we had all carried had begun to stitch themselves closed. One evening, as we sat around the dining table sharing stories late into the night, I realized how far we had come. The fear and mistrust that had threatened to tear us apart were being replaced by a fragile, but growing sense of unity. I felt a deep gratitude for the courage it had taken all of us to face the pain and choose reconciliation. It was not perfect, old wounds sometimes flared, but the commitment to healing was steadfast. As I looked around at their faces, illuminated by the soft glow of candlelight, I knew this was a new beginning. The holiday gathering that had once symbolized exclusion had transformed into a celebration of resilience and love. Though the journey ahead would still have challenges, we were ready to face them together, grounded in honesty and respect. In that moment, surrounded by family, I felt a cautious but genuine hope. Hope that we could build something stronger, something lasting. And as I raised my glass in a quiet toast, I silently promised myself to nurture this fragile piece, to be patient, and to keep the lines of communication open. This was not just a reunion. It was the foundation of a renewed family, ready to embrace the future with open hearts. The days that followed the holiday gathering were a quiet testament to the work that healing demands, slow, sometimes invisible, but undeniable. I found myself sitting on my porch one evening, the air crisp and tinged with the scent of pine from a nearby grove. The sky was a deepening shade of blue, the first stars beginning to twinkle shyly above. In that stillness, I let my mind drift over the journey that had brought me here. From the shock of exclusion to the fragile warmth of reconciliation. It hadn't been easy. There were moments when doubt threatened to creep back in, when old wounds flared with unexpected sharpness. But through it all, I had discovered a resilience within myself I hadn't known I possessed. A strength born not of bitterness, but of forgiveness and the determination to reclaim my place in the family I loved. I thought about how, at first, I had felt powerless, shut out without explanation, reduced to a ghost in the stories they told. But I refused to accept that role. Instead, I chose to listen, to understand, and to confront the silence with honesty. That choice had changed everything. The conversations that followed the holiday had been raw and real, forcing us all to face uncomfortable truths. Yet, in facing those truths, we found a path forward. Apologies were exchanged, yes, but more importantly, a commitment was made to communicate openly, to listen deeply, and to honor each other's experiences. I smiled softly, recalling the evenings spent around the table, the slow rebuilding of trust like the careful stitching of a torn garment. The family I had feared lost was not gone. It had been waiting beneath the surface, waiting for us to find our way back. In those moments, I realized that boundaries were vital. Setting them had allowed me to protect my own heart, while opening space for others to step in with respect and care. I had learned that self-respect was not selfish, it was necessary. The experience had also taught me the importance of recognizing when to stand firm and when to yield, of balancing courage with compassion. I had stood my ground, yes, but I had also extended a hand. That balance had been the key to breaking the cycle of hurt and misunderstanding. As I sat there, the night growing deeper around me, I made a decision. I would document this journey, not as a tale of pain, but as a map for others who might find themselves lost in similar shadows. I wanted to share the lessons of resilience, of the power in confronting silence, and the hope that comes from daring to seek reconciliation. I thought of the countless others who might feel invisible within their own families, silenced by rumors or misunderstandings. If my story could help even one person find their voice, I would know that the struggle had been worth it. I also recognized that this was not an end, but a beginning. The work of maintaining healthy relationships is ongoing, requiring vigilance and care. But now I felt equipped, not just with stories of hurt, but with stories of healing. The stars above twinkled brighter, as if affirming my resolve. I felt a profound sense of peace settle within me, the kind that comes from knowing you have reclaimed your life and your dignity. I was no longer the excluded sister, the whispered rumor, the shadow in family photographs. I was Clara, whole, empowered, and ready to embrace the future with grace. As I stood to go inside, the cool night air brushing against my face, I carried with me a quiet confidence. I had learned to set boundaries, to voice my truth, and to open my heart without fear. And though the path ahead would surely hold challenges, I was no longer afraid. I was free,